Rude executive humiliates janitor in a corporate lounge, unaware that Morgan Freeman is watching. What is a janitor doing in here? This lounge is for executives, not people like him. Like a thundercloud, the words hung in the air, ruining the once civilized environment of Skyline Executive Lounge, a posh waiting area on Manhattan's top floor. High-ranking business executive William Harrington, the speaker, reclined back in his leather chair, glancing at the old janitor with barely veiled contempt. Samuel Carter, a 62-year-old janitor, stood a few feet away, clutching his mop handle, and said nothing. Years of hard labor had left his hands calloused. His uniform was tidy, even if its fabric had faded. This kind of remarks he had heard before. Too many times. Still today, though? One other person was listening today. Sitting just a few feet away, Morgan Freeman gently placed down his coffee. And what transpired next? Everyone in the room would be rendered still. Is everyone's respect shared? Comment 1 ? Is it only for the rich? Comment 0. Designed for the elite, the powerful, the untouchable, the Skyline Executive Lounge was a place from the handcrafted espresso makers to the imported marble flooring. Every element screamed uniqueness. For more than 20 years, Samuel Carter had labored in this building, ensuring that everything stayed perfect for the very individuals who hardly knew him. Without thinking twice, he had cleaned their messes, dumped their garbage, and polished the floors they walked on. Still, he was invisible to guys like William Harrington. That is, up until right now. William let out a loud, exaggerated sigh as Samuel silently mopped next to the coffee station, trying not to disrupt the high-profile customer traffic. "I swear," he said to his friend, loud enough for everyone in the lounge to hear. "They will let anyone in here these days." His speech dripped with contempt, his gaze locked on Samuel as though he were a stain on a perfect landscape. A woman close murmured, obviously uneasy, "Excuse me?" Samuel stopped midway across a swipe, his hold on the mop handle tightening. He had visited here once beforehand. The looks, the whispered insults, the silent expectation he would simply accept it and go on. And perhaps he would have, should today have been any other day. But just now, Morgan Freeman observed, the Skyline Executive Lounge was where power was demanded rather than merely expected. Here, every element, the imported leather chairs, the subtle hum of business deals running over handcrafted espresso, the faint clinking of fine china, whispered of riches and exclusivity. Men like William Harrington felt right here in surroundings like this. It was a place designed for men in charge of boardrooms, set the course of industry, and never, under any conditions, cleaned their own messes. William felt so personally aggrieved when Samuel Carter, a janitor in a worn blue uniform, entered the lounge with a mop in one hand and a bucket in the other. He couldn't overlook the sight of a working guy among the privileged, just as he could ignore a speck on a perfectly polished mirror. William sighed slowly, deliberately, sat back in his chair, whirling the coffee in his hand, then pushed his colleague Robert with his elbow. "Tell me I'm not the only one who finds this ridiculous," he said, sounding irritated. From his laptop, Robert looked up to follow William's eye toward Samuel, who was silently cleaning close to the coffee stand. Clearly turned off, Robert asked, "What is?" William made a faint gesture. "That," he murmured, as though the very fabric of the lounge was offended by Samuel's sheer existence. "A janitor, in an executive space, cleaning, while we're still here." Robert wrinkled slightly, as though he was looking for the appropriate reply. "Well, somebody has to keep this place looking nice," he shrugged. William shook his head and laughed short austerely. "Right, but do they have to do it right now?" he sneered. "Honest, it's bad enough they even let these people in here. Can't they at least wait until we've left?" Every word Samuel heard was accurate. Indeed, he did. He was accustomed to hearing things like this, the barely veiled remarks, the contemptuous looks, the unwritten presumption that men like him were invisible. But today the words fell strangely. Perhaps it was because he had been employed here for more than 20 years, and nevertheless, to men like William, he was just a uniform with a mop. Perhaps it was because he had formerly been an engineer, then had to accept whatever work he could find to help his family during layoffs. Perhaps it was because he had created genuine objects, things of value, only to find himself scrubbing after men who wouldn't last a day in his former environment. Perhaps, just perhaps, it was because someone else was listening today. His hands steady despite the boiling heat building in his chest as he kept scrubbing down the counter. He then noticed eyes staring him from across the room. Morrison Freeman, the famous actor, had been watching the whole debate while seated in the corner with a silent cup of coffee. His face was blank. William exclaimed, "Excuse me," somewhat elevating his voice to attract more attention. Mid-wipe, Samuel stopped and turned to face him carefully. His voice firm and professional, he asked, "Yes, sir," William chuckled. "I was just wondering," he gestured vaguely, "knowing you will never be more than what you are. How does it feel?" Quiet. A weighty, awkward silence like a tightrope running across the lounge. Robert stiffened in his seat, fidgety. From their emails, some execs looked up. A younger man at the espresso machine paused, his fingers lingering over his cup. A woman beside the window turned aside, acting not to hear. Sensing the change in energy, the barista behind the counter also swallowed anxiously. Samuel spoke nothing, not only because he lacked words, but this was the time he had always been trained to withstand, to keep his head down, to let the moment pass, to remember that guys like William never suffered repercussions for their words. Now, though, someone was about to make sure he did today. That's an odd thing to say right now. Though the voice was low, it cut across the air like a razor-sharp sword somehow. Every head in the lounge aimed at the speaker, and then, gently laying his coffee down, was Morgan Freeman. The room's ambiance changed immediately. Startled, William laughed nervously and straightened his tie fast to try to collect himself. He said, "Mr. Freeman," attempting a smile, "I failed to see you there." Morgan arched an eyebrow, a subdued but clear indication he was bored. "That's the thing about people like you," he said, his voice bearing the kind of authority that wouldn't have needed loudness to be strong. "You only saw what you think matters." A quiet murmur drifted over the lounge. A few of executives looked at each other. Robert pushed hard for a swallow. The barista stopped midway through a pour, her hands quivering slightly as she understood that whatever was going to happen would be discussed for years. William moved uneasily, his customary assurance erasing under Morgan's stare. "Listen, I didn't mean nothing by it," he continued rapidly, his voice not quite as consistent as it had been. Morgan slanted his head slightly, his face unreadable. "You didn't mean anything by it?" he asked, his voice deliberately quiet. William nodded, then licked his lips. "Right," he answered. "I was just chatting. No damage intended." Before answering, Morgan let the words hang for a pulse. "Ah," he murmured at last, nodding. "No damage intended. That's the excuse, isn't it?" The space seemed smaller, the air heavier. Slowly leaning forward, Morgan rested his forearms on his knees. "Tell me, Mr. Harrington," he continued, his voice falling just slightly, "if no injury was intended, why did it feel so familiar?" William turned pale on his face. He was not only in an executive lounge unexpectedly. Every nasty comment he had ever uttered, every time he had reduced someone, every moment he had thought he was untouchable. And for first time in his life, not the most powerful man in the room. William assumed he was in control. He felt his statements would have little effect. But what none in that room could have predicted, that the man going to impart knowledge to him was Morgan Freeman. Over the Skyline Executive Lounge, a nervous silence descended. Once busy hum of executives on phone conversations, laptops clicking, and espresso machines churning had turned into uncomfortable silence. The words of Morgan Freeman still lingered in the air, cutting through the haughtiness that had enveloped the room just a few years ago. William Harrington, a guy accustomed to running the room with his riches and reputation, now came under examination from someone whose presence exceeded every dollar in his bank account. The weight of the occasion stayed with him. and he knew for the first time he was the one under evaluation. Desperate to take back his power, William forcedly laughed. "Mr. Freeman, let's not make this bigger than it is," he added, tightening his tie. "I was simply noticing something." Morgan tilted his head, his face calm yet relentless. "An observation?" he asked, as if tasting the word, allowing its meaning to completely sink before deconstructing it. He pointed at Samuel, who was still standing by the coffee counter, his mop laying on his side, his face inscrutable. "Tell me, Mr. Harrington," Morgan said, his voice both soft and piercing. "What exactly did you observe?" William hesitated, then acutely conscious of the eyes fixed on him. "Well," he said, "this is an executive lounge designed for people of a certain level." Morgan nodded leisurely. "A certain level," he said in a firm voice. "And you think that what precisely determines level?" The query hung weighty and unresolved. William cleared his throat in an attempt to rein in the chatter. With a contemptuous sneer, "Look," he added, "we all worked hard to get here. Some of us just belong more than others." The second the words emerged from his mouth, a change reverberated across the lounge. William's co-worker Robert, who had laughed along before, suddenly seemed somewhat uneasy. A woman seated at the window folded her arms, her face incomprehensible. Frozen mid-pour, the barista behind the counter gripped the coffee pot just a little tighter. Still silent, Samuel exhaled softly, as though this was only another in a lifetime of hearing the same thing. Morgan slanted back slightly, as though considering the remarks. He nodded one more at that. "I see," he said, quite plain. William let out a relieved breath, momentarily believing the chat was ended. He misled me, since Morgan still had to finish. Not even nearly close. Morgan moved slightly and now spoke to the room, not just William. "I've met a lot of strong men in my life," he remarked, his voice flowing naturally and softly, infusing the room with quiet authority. "CEOs, world leaders, billionaires," says one. He stopped to let the weight of his remarks rest in the room. "And you know what I've learned?" he said. Nobody answered. "The richest men I have ever known were not the ones with the most money." A murmur floated around the lounge. A few executives leaned forward with interest. Others moved about in their seats, not sure where this was leading. William, too, realized he couldn't turn away despite himself. Morgan waved at Samuel. "You see this man?" he questioned. Unused to being the center of attention, Samuel stiffened somewhat. "He has spent over 20 years working in this building," Morgan said. "He's the reason this lounge stays clean. The reason you get to sit in a polished chair, drink from spotless cups, walk on flooring free of yesterday's coffee spills on them." Morgan turned to William once more. "And still, in your view, he doesn't fit here?" William opened his mouth, but no came out. For the first time in his life, he was on the losing side of a conversation he started. Morgan slanted forward somewhat. "Tell me, Mr. Harrington," he asked, his voice lowering just enough to land every word like a hammer. "What would happen if men like Samuel decided they didn't belong here anymore?" Quietness. Unwavering. Effective. Uncertain of how to answer, William blinked. Morgan offered a little knowing smile. "That's the thing about guys like you," he said. "You never consider what's beneath you until it's gone." A few nodded gently, their faces changing as they realized his words spoke truth to them. William was still trying to understand what was occurring, though. He was not used to being corrected, and he most definitely wasn't used to be wrong. Morgan got up slowly, his motions careful and methodical. Every eye turned to follow him. William's breath stopped, as though he could feel his influence's very threads breaking apart. Morgan set a hand on Samuel's shoulder, his voice steady. "Men like this," he remarked, "are the foundation of every successful business, every smooth-running corporation, every place you take for granted." He fixed William straight in the eyes. "And yet the only time you notice them is when you want to remind them that they are beneath you." William clenched his teeth, but this time he did not argue. Given what he could say, what? Each single individual in that room understood the truth. And the truth was that he had just been humbled in the most public manner imaginable. Morgan turned back toward Samuel, flashing a subdued smile. "Mr. Carter," he replied, "you have been working here for 20 years? Samuel nodded, his voice steady but subdued. "Indeed, sir." Morgan slanted his head slightly and wore a careful look on his face. "Then I would say you fit here more than any of us do." The lounge rippled with a whisper of agreement. A small number of individuals really clapped. Surprised, Samuel blinked. His throat tightened immediately. He lacked invisibility for the first time in years. He felt observed for the first time in years. William pushed back his chair, suddenly thinking the space was too small, too heated, too oppressive. He was going to have to go. Now, but Morgan's voice halted him exactly as he stood. "Leaving already, Mr. Harrington." William stopped cold. Morgan's voice did not have a mocking quality. Simply, knowledge was involved. William gasped sharply, then turned to face the exit, his customary arrogance suddenly subdued with silent embarrassment. The lounge said nothing as he vanished through the doors. Finally, then, Morgan turned back, grinning towards Samuel. "Now," he added, his voice once more kind, "how about we get you a coffee?" "My treat?" William, leaving the lounge, felt as though he had lost. He was unaware, though, what none of the people in that room would ever forget, that the true lesson had not been for him. It had been for all the viewers. Once the subdued murmur of professional conversation, the Skyline Executive Lounge had become almost like a courtroom. A location where power was typically defined by money and rank had, for the first time, changed to be the authority of truth, respect, and decency. And Morgan Freeman had just demonstrated that the richest man in the room lacked authority. It belonged to the person who realized what really counted. William Harrington hadn't moved from where he stood, even though he had spent the last 10 minutes cowering beneath the weight of his own conceit. Built on the basis of power and status, his whole universe had just been destroyed in front of peers. And he knew not what to do going forward. William's breath came shallow and erratic. His thoughts ran to discover a way out, but none at all. He could sense it, the weight of every eye in the room now squarely on him, no longer in appreciation but in criticism. Executives, investors, business elites, these were his people. Still, they were not looking at him as one of their own at this instant. Their view was of Morgan Freeman, and even worse, they were staring at Samuel Carter, the janitor William had dismissively thrown aside. That kind of change was one that no sum of money could reverse, a form of societal reckoning not possible for any PR staff to erase. William was actually out of his depth for the first time in his life. Ever cool, Morgan did not push. He had no need of it. For him, the stillness handled all the chores. Then he sat back against the chair gently, crossed his knees, and slanted his head slightly. "I imagine this is a bit uncomfortable for you, Mr. Harrington," he continued, his voice light but solid as iron. William's mouth closed tightly. "I don't see why this is turning into such a spectacle," he said, forcing himself to seem unaffected, but the little trembling in his voice betrayed him. Morgan smiled knowingly. "A spectacle?" he asked. "Interesting selection of words." He pointed toward Samuel, who was still, his hands folded in front of him, his face unreadable. "I wonder," Morgan said, "was it a spectacle when you decided to humiliate this man for simply existing in the same space as you?" A quiet descended deeper over the room. A few turned aside, the uneasiness invading their own conscience now. Suddenly, this went beyond William now. This was about every single person who has ever disregarded, discounted, or denigrated someone merely because it would have been convenient. William exhaled sharply, wiping his brow as though he were attempting to organize his ideas. His voice softer than before, he continued at last. "I wasn't trying to humiliate anyone." Morgan asked, "No?" with an eyebrow raised. "Then tell me, Mr. Harrington, if the roles were reverse, if he had spoken to you the way you spoke to him, how would you have felt?" William started to open his mouth, but no words emerged, because the query lacked a defense. All he could see was the truth squarely ahead of him. That truth was also his mistake. A protracted pause passed, and then something quite unusual occurred. For the first time, William turned to Samuel, actually looked at him, not quite as just a janitor, not as someone veneered beneath him, but as a guy too. A man who had spent 2 decades working in this building had probably seen more inside these walls than any of them had. He had endured more than William would have, yet he had never once asked credit for it. William felt small for the first time. Not because someone had snatched away his fortune, not because he had forfeited his title, but he had come to see he had been living life without awareness of the people who kept his world running. And you couldn't unsee truth once you knew it. William turned back to Samuel after swallowing fiercely. His voice changed at this point. Not polished, not haughty, not bursting with excellence. Simply human. He hesitated, then replied, "Mr. Carter, then, I owe you an apology." A few people in the room quietly exhaled, as though they too had been holding their breath for this very instant. Samuel examined him closely. His face was inscrutable, but he nodded respectfully slowly after a beat. "An apology only means something if you mean it, sir," he said merely. William also realized then that was insufficient. It went beyond mere moral behavior. It has to do with improving. And for the first time, he wanted to try. Morgan grinned just so slightly as though he knew exactly how this would turn out. Reaching for his coffee, he sipped one more time, then got up. "You see," he remarked, his voice firm and full of the kind of knowledge derived from experience, "respect isn't something you demand, it's something you give." Looking around the room, he let his words sink in for everyone seeing as well as for William. "And actual power?" he asked next. "It's measured by how many people you lift, not by how many people answer to you." Over the lounge, another wave of quiet passed. Yet this time, it was not unpleasant at all. That was a stillness of knowledge, a quiet of transformation, a quiet with meaning. William nodded once, the weight of what had just happened sinking firmly into his chest. Then he turned and headed toward the exit, his once confident gait now measured and thoughtful. Without another word. Not the same man heading out was the man who had entered this lounge that morning. What next was unknown to him. One thing, nevertheless, was quite clear. He never would see the world the same way once more. Morgan glanced back to Samuel, who was still standing, his shoulders somewhat straighter than they had been. "Mr. Carter," he continued kindly, "I believe we were about to have that coffee?" Samuel nodded gently and laughed quietly. "Yes, sir, I'd like that." And the energy in the room changed permanently as they headed for the barista. Given this went beyond simply a CEO and a janitor. This encompassed more than one chat at a lounge. This was about a reminder that every boardroom, every office, every location where respect was regarded as something earned, rather than something deserved, needed to be heard. Every single person observing understood at that instant they had just seen something they would never forget. William left the lounge with a lesson he would live with always. He was unaware, though, what none in that room could have foreseen, that this event would transform more than just him. It would alter everyone else observing. Standing outside the Skyline Executive Lounge, William Harrington gazed blankly at the gleaming marble floor underneath. He had been the most potent man in the room moments earlier. At least that was his lifelong belief. These days, though, he now saw how little power really meant without respect accompanying it. He had been speaking to people like Samuel Carter for years as though their efforts went unseen and unappreciated. He had discounted their value, written off their presence, and thought they didn't important since they cleaned floors rather than closed sales. But tonight he had been obliged to see himself through the prism of others, and he found what he saw objectionable. Inside, Morgan Freeman took a seat and picked up his coffee as though the whole discussion had been little more than friendly banter. For everyone else in the room, though, his remark still hung in the air like an indisputable fact. Samuel Carter had never sought accolades. He had spent decades maintaining this architectural gem flawless. He had just done his duty with quiet dignity. And tonight, among men who had never really seen him before, he had been the most moral man in the room. William exhaled, stroking his temple as the awareness sank firmly into his chest. He hesitated, then headed back toward the lounge. Then, walking near Samuel, he moved with an unusual rigidity. Samuel raised his head to meet William's. There was quiet for a period long enough. William then started to cough clean. His voice softer than before, he added, "I was wrong. I shouldn't have told you that way." Samuel watched him closely before nodding slightly. "An apology starts well, sir," he remarked, "but what you do following that counts more." William nodded slowly and choked heavily. Morgan Freeman laid his cup down gently, clinking it against the table. "You see, Mr. Harrington," he began, his voice bearing the same subdued power that had quieted the audience before, "a person's true worth is never measured by what they own, but by how they treat the people they think they don't need." William listened to those remarks, and the lounge stayed quiet. And he really understood them at that very moment. First in his life. This narrative helps us to see that real respect comes from compassion, integrity, and humility rather than from title, riches, or prestige. One's value comes from their character, not from their employment. William lived his life thinking power made him valuable, but now he discovered respect is something you give, not something you demand. The best leaders are those who recognize, value, and inspire the individuals who maintain the world in operation rather than those who occupy the top posts. One act of dignity and one moment of acknowledgement will transform someone's whole viewpoint. Ultimately, though, the riches we carry in our hearts will always be worth more than the riches in our financial accounts.